I was just doing the minutes while we're going. So we are recording, and give me 1 second with the YouTube. And hold on 1 second, sorry. One more second. Okay, you know what? So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to live stream. So we are recording. We have quorum. We do have a member of the public here. You can start.
Okay, so we're just going to introduce ourselves then.
Yeah, that'd be great. Just like a normal at the beginning of every committee. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Betty McIntosh, co-chair of the Chelsea Land Use Committee. Paul?
And I'm Paul Devlin, co-chair of the Chelsea Land Use Committee. Bert?
Bert Lazarus, member of the Chelsea Land Use Committee.
David?
Dave Haloka. Hi, Carrie, member of the Chelsea Land Use Committee.
Marty?
I'm Marty DeCat, member of the Chelsea Land Use Committee.
And Kit?
Hi, Carrie. Good to see you. Kit Tollerson, also a member of the Chelsea Land Use Committee.
And Tina? No. Tina?
There you go.
What?
Tina didn't give her computer permission to use this app.
Tina, we can't hear you. We can read your lips.
I can see you say, I don't know why.
You're not muted, Tina, but so I'm not really sure what's going on.
Well, anyway, you know, Tina, maybe you'll figure it out. Mike?
Yeah, Mike Noble, member of the Chelsea Land Use Committee. Hello.
And
That's Vera, and I can tell by the background.
that's Karen. Do you want to say hello to our new member, Carrie?
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Hmm?
Sorry, I'm just getting off one Zoom meeting and jumping into the other one, so I didn't hear you, Betty. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Okay, and I guess we have some representatives of our elected officials. Maya, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi folks, I'm Maya. I'm from State Senator Brad Hoylman's office. Nice to see you all.
Good to see you. And Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, it's Matt Ty from Assemblymember Godfrey's office.
Welcome. I think now we can go start. Jesse?
Yeah, we can definitely start. I just want to make sure we only have one member of the public, but just to make sure they understand that that if they would like to speak on any of the items that are on the agenda, they should raise their virtual hand, which is in the participants section, and you just press the virtual hand raise and the hand will go up and Betty or Paul will call on you. If for some reason you are unable to do that, you can always put something in the Q&A tab on the bottom that just says that you want to you have a question to ask. So, but that portion of the meeting will come later.
Okay, I think got our housework done. So we're back to item number 1, the front facade window project at 456 West 23rd Street. And the Chelsea Land Use Committee reviewed this. And then we wrote a letter that was voted out at July 31st, 2019, full board. And what it really was is a very straightforward project. And we recommended approval of the application with the recommendation that LPC, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, research and determine whether the original window style was different from what the applicant was proposing in this renewal project, because there was a building to the east and maybe some to the west that show possibly original arched windows shape design. So we found out that now the LPC has approved this project, but the applicant is proposing to change the composition of the frames that from 40% wood fiber to 100% wood, all right? Now, they portray this as a scope that has been reduced, the applicant has, and technically the applicant does not have to come back to the community board for Chelsea Land Use Committee or the board. Landmarks is holding a public meeting, not to be confused with a public hearing, on this project, okay? So apparently, we don't honestly know if Landmarks researched the original design issue or not. So we're kind of in the dark about that. And it seems that it's the material, the wood fiber material, that is the change here. And then we just wanted to update you on this reduced scope on this and see if you had any comments about that. So we're opening it up for anybody who'd like to say something about this. And on the committee, one route is we could do nothing. One route is we could send our July 31st letter, 2019 letter with some kind of a brief cover letter saying, you know, we had recommended that the commission research this, you know, what happened? You know, are they ignoring that, or are they didn't think it was important or something like that? So Paul, do you want to add any more to that idea?
No, I think that you were clear. It's just a public meeting on an issue that we've already approved. And technically they're going from a combination of wood fibers to another combination to all wood, which is something that we had supported in the past. There's no change to the arch of the windows above. We don't know if LPC investigated it or not. But the applicant is really in a kind of a bind because they're going through a facade change right now and they need to do these replacements. And they've changed the composite material from a combination to natural wood, and they have to go through this sort of process to get it approved. So I'm inclined just to really not do anything. Let them, you know, let LPC staff approve what we've previously approved and let them move on with their project.
Any
A question?
Sure.
Yeah, you said they're having a meeting rather than a hearing. Why? And what's the purpose of a meeting and why not have a hearing? Or I'm just confused about that.
Yeah. Jesse, do you've communicated with Landmarks? Did they explain?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like why LPC chooses to give a project a hearing over a meeting, I would actually defer to David, because David's and maybe Vera, and they've had much more experience with this. But you know, basically, you know, a hearing is usually the first time the application and project has come before the commission. In terms of that specific application, not the first time the building has come before the commission. But so that technically, I think from their perspective, at least from LPC's perspective, they've had a hearing on the overall application, which was the window replacement application. Since then, the project has changed, and you know, but it's still the same project. So it's not therefore another public hearing to be had. What they're sort of doing is tacking it on to a series of other the agenda you know, that they've already set. So this is just going to be one of the many things that they're going to be updating the commission on. I think, and again, I defer to David a little bit. I think really where this came from was that there was a big changeover for the applicant in terms of leadership of who was sort of handling this project, and then the project itself changed. And then so LPC said, well, maybe you need to go back and check with just see what the community board thinks. So, because it wasn't clear necessarily to any of us what exactly LPC was expecting them to be, you know, requesting from us.
Yeah, and in the meantime, the co-op president died. So then there's a new person who's working on this. So it's sort of a new perspective or something like that.
David Haluk and Michael Noble have their hands up, just so I'm just making
David?
Yeah, hi. I think, you know, similar to the, on a much smaller scale, to the Gansevoort Market project, which went from a public hearing and into a major change and then only into a public meeting without another public hearing. This is considered a minor enough change that it wouldn't have another public hearing with public input. I'm a little chagrined on this one. I did some more digging, and I had overlooked in the Historic District Extension Designation Report from 1981 that this house, it's described as having been originally identical to 8 other houses in the same row. And the designation report points out that there's a 1915 photograph of number 462 from the collection of the New York Historical Society that shows a pretty intact original version. So we do have a good indication of what this building would have looked like and the nature of the windows. And they in fact have what are called segmental heads. They're sort of circle sections. They actually show casement windows with transoms on the parlor floor. So it's pretty clear what the historic condition would have been. I also looked at Landmark's rules about substituting materials, and in a row house in a historic district, unless it's just a square topped 1/1 double hung window that's being replaced, it has to be replaced in the original or historic configuration and material. So I suspect what happened was that the applicant, in a meeting with, probably as a result of the public hearing, was told, no, you can't do this in this composite material, it's got to be wood. So they're coming back for that. And Landmarks holds primary facades to a different standard. That's why Landmarks could have approved this Anderson Fibrex synthetic material for the rear windows, but wouldn't allow it for the front ones. So what I would suggest is that we do a new letter that welcomes the use of the wood, but also references the designation report and the image in it of 462 as the indicator of what the original condition would have been, and ask Landmarks to call for matching the original configuration as well as material, and simply stating that they should refer to, it's actually on page 32 of the designation report, there's an image. And that image has now been digitized in high resolution at the website of the New York Historical Society. So if you wanted to zoom in on it and really get a good sense of what you should be basing the new windows on, that's now available. And we could even reference that in the letter. Again, there wouldn't be any public discussion of it at Landmarks, but it would still be taken under advisement by the commission.
Well, thank you for digging and researching. I think you probably did more than Landmarks Preservation Commission did. Really. Let me just be clear, because in our letter we used simple words in terms of arched windows. That is the same as what you said in more technical terms, I assume? Yes? Yeah, okay. Who was the next person? who,
Can I interject for 1 second? David, can you send me a copy of that really quickly? I want to take a look at it, please. And it's, the
Sure.
designation report doesn't have a page. You said it was on the designation report, page 32. There is no page 32.
Well, page 30, it follows page 31, which describes the houses. So, you know, if it had a page number on it, it would be page 32. You want to be looking at the Chelsea Historic District Extension designation report. It's from 1981. And if you just Google Chelsea Historic District Extension designation report, it should come up.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the regular designation report.
Right. You just,
if you have, David, if you have the ability, if you want to copy it and paste it into the chat, then everybody will be able to access it pretty quickly.
Okay, I'll see if I can.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, David.
Just the HP. Yeah, just the link.
yeah, I wouldn't be fast enough to find it myself. Who was it, Kit, that you had your hand up?
No, Mike Noble had his hand up.
Oh, Mike Noble. Mike?
Yeah, hi. Well, David answered my question pretty well there. I just wanted to, distinguish, meetings and hearings and all that business. My question is, though, the commission itself does review this, right?
Well,
is that right, David? I mean,
yes.
The commission is at the hearing, right? And they
Yes.
they will in fact see this as if it were a meeting, right?
Yes.
Okay. Because then, just for for my edification and for the new members as well, Carrie, for example, at some point we should describe what kinds of things get staff level reviews and approvals and which don't, and why this particular, you answered it, why this one did not, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, but you're the guy who I think is best able to, tell people how this thing works, because
yeah, this isn't
in the
this.
beginning, if you're not aware of it from the beginning, some of it's a mystery,
Yeah, in this case, it's not a matter of staff level versus, the commission. It's a matter, what happens is Landmarks Commission has a first forum that's called the public hearing. And at that, the public is allowed to speak. And once they get past that, if they decide to kick the can down the road and decide after the applicant has made changes that they may have requested, it usually goes into a public meeting. And there may be multiple public meetings where the commission continues to discuss it, but they're different from public hearings in that the public can't speak. Often what will happen is that there'll be a public hearing. The applicant comes back with changes based on what the commissioners said in the public hearing. And the next meeting is a public meeting, meaning no public input, even if major changes have been made, which is what happened with Gansevoort Market. And, I think it's up to Landmarks to decide whether the changes are significant enough that it should go back to another public hearing or into the kind of closed door public meeting process. And, we discovered on Gansevoort Market, they were pretty considerable changes that were made, and they didn't go back before a public hearing. It went into a public meeting. Nonetheless, we can submit testimony to Landmarks for the public meeting, which they're all supposed to read before the meeting. So we have a voice, it's just that we can't speak publicly. Staff level stuff it's considered minor enough that it wouldn't have a public hearing to begin with. So if you're changing the rear windows on your house, that can be done according to established rules on the staff level and doesn't go before a public hearing. So I've moved the link into the chat. I don't know if you can open it there.
Yeah, it was very helpful. Thank you, David.
So can this be shown, Jesse? So I don't.
Yeah, I definitely, if that's what we want to do.
I mean, because if I open it, it'll be on top of my Zoom screen.
No,
if you want to give me share screen, I can do it too.
I'll do it. You're talking about the photo, David, right?
Right, I just added, the photo should be, following numbered page 31.
Yeah, I got it. Hold on.
And I just entered a link to it at New York Historical Society. That's the high resolution image you can zoom in on that we might want to reference in our letter.
This is what does everybody see what I just shared?
So what we're looking at is what, David? This picture?
It's a couple doors down. It is number 462 in the center.
In the center.
Yeah, and the designation report says it was a row of 9 identical row houses, and this seems to be the best preserved one from a photo of 1915. The houses were built in 1857, so it's completely plausible that these are the original windows we're looking at. And you can see they're 2/2 double hung on the upper floors, and you can see that the wood frame is actually curved. And some of the row houses, that you see when you walk down the street now have the curved frames, and it's not because they're 150 years old. They've simply been replaced.
Hey, Jesse.
With curved heads.
Jesse, can you scroll down a little bit? There's another image that shows the squared ones so that people who aren't familiar with this can see, like zoom in on that one now so that people can see the difference of the photo. If you look at the window right next to that street lamp, so it's the glass itself is squared off at the top versus now go back to the other one and you'll see the glass at the top is rounded. So those of you who aren't familiar with that's the distinction and the difference. And so that little roundness at the top of the windows is what David is saying. We should be respectful of the extension report, designation report, and ask them to replace them in that format, whereas they currently have the squared off top, which is what you see in that picture.
Right.
Now, this is naive, but it seems to me that it would be more expensive if you're changing the shape of the window.
It is.
Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
Well, it's more expensive to make a window with a curved top, but it's the historic district.
I just want to clarify. So now, if you look at the building just to the left of the lamp post, okay, those windows look like they're square.
Yeah, what they do is they put like a flat panel that's kind of arc-shaped at the top of the window frame, and it's less expensive than actually curving the part of the window frame that holds the glass or the sash. So
the windows in our proposal here, 4, 5, 6, their windows would be like the ones to the left of the lamppost.
Everything in this picture, everything in this photo has the squared top glass. So this is what it would look like. And then Jesse, if you go up to the other picture, this is what it would look like if they replaced the glass top. So the concrete framing, the molding around it is all exactly the same. It's just the glass itself of the window that's curved.
And they do still make, David, rounded windows like that. I mean,
it would probably be a custom window, but even mass producers of windows like Marvin Windows are set up to do, windows made to size. You probably wouldn't find an off-the-shelf window that fit perfectly, but this is not an excessive thing.
But we're not asking for the impossible.
No, not at all.
Okay.
And it's a row house in a historic district, so it's warranted.
Okay. Other comments? Thank you. That was very helpful, David. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Committee members? Viren?
No, I'm good. I think David's covered everything. And it's not an impossible task. And in Williamsburg, people make curved frames. In this case, it's not only the curved glass top, you're also talking about curved frame up top. And it's not an impossible thing to achieve. We should ask for it.
Other thoughts from other committee people?
So I would wrap up by saying then that I think what we want to do is ask for the for LPC to request that these windows be replaced in their original format. David, I suspect though we're not going to get it because it's already pretty far along in the process, but I think it's worth asking for. And then but we should reiterate that this is a similar request to what we made in previous years. We can cite the examples that we've given in the past. We can cite the requirements by LPC regulations. So
right. I mean, it's not asking for anything more than what the landmarks rules, which are part of the city administrative code, requires.
Can we include the language where in case they decide to deviate from it, they respond to us?
I'm sorry, Viren, what did you say?
Can we request LPC in case they decide not to take a recommendation and do whatever they want to do? Will we get can we request a response from them in writing or something? Or they just do what they do?
Personally, I doubt it, but David knows the activity.
We can request it.
Yeah.
You know,
it might seem like a little bit of a naive request. You know, when we care about something like this, what we often do is just watch for it to appear on the calendar to see how Landmarks rules. And it may even be that Landmarks has already said to them, you know, you have to have the arch tops. And there's a little bit of wiggle room in the language of the landmarks law. It says you have to match the original or historic window configuration. So does historic mean one that might have been there 100 years ago, but isn't original? In this case, I really would hope that landmarks would go with requiring the arch shape on the sash. And even as you look at this image, you can see how much nicer it is. And the original builder of these buildings spent a lot more money to create those masonry openings with curved tops than it cost to put the windows in them. And it's just that over the years, you know, different owners of the buildings have taken the cheap route in replacing the windows. But the whole idea of, you know, landmarks preservation is to honor the original.
thank you. Can we, Jesse, can you make us back into gallery? I think we're done with the photo, right? Okay. So the direction it looks like we're going is to say that we welcome the 100% wood instead of the 40% wood fiber, and that we ask that LPC require that the arched windows and all this background with the 8 or 9 identical houses in the row and the photo be followed. And this is consistent with our past positions. Does that summarize it for you guys? Can we take a vote? If you are okay, go like that.
Betty, what it doesn't do is repeat that the landmark, that I'm repeating what David said, that it's in landmarks rules already, that we're just following those rules. That should be in the, and yes, I vote in favor.
Right. We did say something like that in our early letter. Historically, be special windows defined by commission's rules. And, you know, we said, and I think the people who don't have, though there's the elected officials, they're not voting. Okay. Kerry, you okay on this one? Okay. And
Betty, can I just get clarity for the minutes? Are we?
Hold on. Tina needs to be muted. She's echoing. Tina, please mute. Thank you.
Sorry, Tina. Our previous letter was an approval with conditions. We were doing the same, just so I understand what we're voting on.
We're writing a new letter. We can attach the old letter. We can repeat the thing that we said in the 2019 letter and then say, in addition, we have researched this in more depth and found that blah, blah, blah.
That's fine. I'm just clarifying whether we're writing an approval with conditions rather than a denial unless.
Oh,
That's what I just, for the minute.
approval versus denial?
Yeah, I mean,
Hmm.
I'm just, land use has done denials unless in the past, and you've also done, with the 2019 letter, you did an approval with a condition. So as everybody's,
Hmm.
it's a slight variation, but it's clearly communicating something much stronger.
Well,
I'm not trying to create more problems.
but I don't know, can you write deny unless, well, we could say that you haven't followed the condition that we said, and LPC obviously didn't research this.
I'm just, right,
So what
you
is
guys.
there a feeling
in terms of-
among the committee about denial versus approval with another condition or something? Marty?
This being a continuation of the previous approval, I think I would stay with approval with a condition.
I was just going to say the opposite. I was going to say that we should be strong about this, especially in light of David's remarks that he doesn't think it's going to go anywhere anyway, in saying that, look, this is really an important thing. It's a historical district. It's a historic front. We think the whole process should be stopped unless you do this. And that might get their attention, might not.
Okay, any other people have comments on that?
David, Tina, and Michael all have their hands up.
David.
Well, I think Marty might make a good point that since, we have found this new information, it would signal a change in our opinion. So,
The disapproval unless,
right.
okay, well, but we can still say we welcome the wood.
No, it's denial unless, Betty.
Right, denial unless.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Denial, yeah, denial, wrong word, denial unless. Okay, so we now have more fine-tuned resolution. Can you raise your hand?
Mike has his hand up. I wasn't sure. If he's...
Oh, I'm sorry, Michael?
Oh, that hand is to approve. Because you can't see me, all right? So from here on, when you see that, that means approve, yes.
Okay, so let's just try this one more time. All right, so we're going to do denial unless for the arched windows. We did the research. Landmarks didn't follow what we suggested in the letter, and we welcome the all wood. I think we're good on that. Can smile, wave your hand, whatever.
Anybody just clarifying? No one else is voting in any other direction but approving of the.
Okay. And there's no people not voting.
Does Hector want to abstain since he wasn't a part of the conversation?
Yeah, Hector, I think needs to abstain at this point.
What did you say, Paul?
Guys.
Hector will be listed as an attendee at the meeting, but he's probably going to abstain from this vote since he just joined us.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ed.
Present but not eligible.
And
He's better off just being listed as not voting at all since he just joined. Abstentions isn't something that we want to encourage.
we don't like abstentions. Yeah. Okay. We'll just pretend he was really later. I usually ask at the end of the meeting, but David, can you write a first draft? Thank you. And
Thank you, David.
Paul and
Appreciate
I
your work
will
on this.
fiddle around. Yeah, that was really quite something. Okay.
All right, on to
Thank
the
you,
budget.
everybody. On to the budget. Paul?
So just to give a quick overview to some of you who don't recall the process, the community board puts together a list of desires and needs for the upcoming fiscal year. This is the start of the process. Each committee presents its, what the term is, district needs or something like that. So each committee then reports into the full board. There's a special committee that reviews them all, sets the priorities for the community board, and we put in a request of budget funding for district needs. Then the budget process goes through the city council, the mayor, blah, blah, blah. The budget gets approved in, I think, July, Jesse, is that right? So we're in the very early stages of this. So this is the point at which we start to think about what our community district needs are that we want to see funding for in the next fiscal year, which is a year from now. Last year, what made it into our community board district needs were 2 Department of Building code enforcement positions. That one of them was already funded and one of them got rejected. So from a land use perspective, there was very little that we added last year. Betty and I were talking about this earlier today. And personally, I just want to add my personal input on this before we carry on the conversation too long, is that given COVID and what we're facing for a city budget, there's going to be no money and we're going to have to see cuts. So I think for us to put in a lot of requests for funding for anything that goes beyond education, public safety, health, and I don't see how the city can fund anything that's extraneous. So I personally think that code enforcement officers and adding on to those is a luxury that we may not be able to afford in the next fiscal year. So I personally am feeling like we take a statement that says, if it's not for education, public safety, and housing, that we don't really make many other additional requests this year.
Yeah,
So,
I would like to add that I agree with Paul. I don't know, did you say security, Paul? Too?
well, public safety, so fire and police,
Public safety, yeah.
education, housing, and then healthcare, hospitals and things like that.
I think, I just think it's a very realistic statement that we could make. Now, maybe the full board would go with that, but.
So can I jump in there real quickly just so people understand? So the budget committee is actually, task force is meeting tomorrow night. So, but we have I rolled out to the exec members, which include Paul and Betty and actually a couple other folks on this call, that basically what I think the budget task force is looking to do, because while we recognize obviously the severity of what's going on right now, but the longevity is that we don't want to necessarily, because there's long-standing goals that I think the community want to continue to advocate for. So they're not looking to rearrange the existing priority numbers. Let me take that back. They're not looking to sort of clean off the entire priority, all last year's priorities and start fresh. What they would like to do is hear what each committee says about the existing priorities, but then have a secondary sort of set of kind of much more current issues that they think that are 2 to 3 issues, which I think actually Paul described very well. So not to say that if you guys decide not to engage in a conversation about the existing priorities that were put in last year and how if they need to be changed or reprioritized or not, that's completely up to your discretion. But in terms of just saying, as the committee wanting just to say, we think these are the 3 most important things right now, and that's fine, and that's what the budget task force is asking, in addition to doing the normal work that you would be doing. So I just wanted to couch that and frame that, which I think Paul did. What Paul's saying is makes sense.
Bert, did you have something you want to add?
Yes. I think we all know that no one knows how much money will be available, what the revenues will be, what we can afford. But I don't think that should deter the committee from maintaining its priorities. And exactly what Jesse says, because we feed to the task force, and then the task force juggles it around and puts in the contingencies. But I don't think we should step back from our priorities. We may even want to phrase it, contingent upon revenue sources. But they should be our priorities, and we shouldn't forget them. That's what I'm saying. And we asked for the hiring. Does anyone know if anyone did anyone fill that budget line? Do we know that, Jesse? If what we asked for happened?
We had 2 requests in last year from this committee that made it through the full cycle and made it into the budget request. And from what I'm seeing, we had to expand code enforcement was on both of them for additional funding for Department of Buildings Enforcement. And the first one was not recommended for funding. And the second one was that the other one position had already been funded. So
Okay.
no additional funding was created based on our requests. But one of the positions was already funded. And then the other was not funded. Am I reading that right, Justin?
It wouldn't even be a priority anymore.
Right. So, I mean, you guys, right. So the providing additional funding for Department of Buildings Enforcement inspectors for non-compliant ADA entrances was funded. And then the special district enforcement request was, the agency response was not recommended to be funded. But the follow-up did say the agency agrees with this request and will accommodate in part. So if there's, there's additional agency responses as they go further down the line into the budget. So I don't know necessarily what that means in terms of in part, but they give a under the additional comments, they do give a brief explanation. But I think at the end of the day, it's not creating a funding line for that, for those two dedicated inspectors.
All right, so let me ask if anybody has, after reviewing, going through last year's budget, looking at the Dropbox materials that Jesse sent around about the budget for this year, were there any items that people on the committee were thinking they wanted to put forward this year? Kit?
I don't know if this is a good idea or a bad idea. I also don't know if it's in bounds or out of bounds, but bear with me on this one. When I went to clean out my desk at our WeWork space, which is not technically in our district, it's just over the line, it was a ghost town. The only people I interacted with were the security agent and a custodian. And I was cleaning out my desk because we downsized from a space for many people to a single person space, and now only have some tech assets there, and don't plan to re-up in the foreseeable future. And I think that anecdote is true for a lot of companies and a lot of nonprofits that had office space in our district. And I think we've seen, hotels that were not doing well in large numbers repurposed temporarily as shelters. There's other spaces like theaters that are sitting vacant. Knowing that affordable housing has been a top priority for a very long time, where not as much progress as any of us would have wanted has been made, I wonder if we encourage some sort of a study of how could space be repurposed, whether that's vacant space or underutilized space, and turned into affordable housing, because I don't think buildings like the one that my WeWork was in are getting all their tenants back, and I don't think all of those hotels are bouncing back in the short term. And I wonder about things like all of the theaters that are going to struggle to reopen, and so it seems like there might be an opportunity to push on how do we think creatively about the next stage for our district, in terms of many of these spaces where their future is very unclear right now. So I don't know how we would word something like that. I don't know if we can ask for something like that to be studied, but it just occurred to me that it could be an opportunity to potentially do something positive coming out of this whole debacle.
And I think that, Kit, I think that's a really great idea. And one of the things that we've talked about, well, Betty and I talked about today, is the issue of these hotels that are turning into homeless shelters, and how is that being planned and how is it being forecasted? HPD just doesn't do that, right? They just fill the vacancies, throw people around, whatever. There doesn't seem to be a real planning strategy in mind there.
It's the Department of Homeless Services. Yeah.
Oh, the Department of Homeless Services, right. DHS, I'm sorry. So many acronyms, so many alphabet soups. So Betty and I talked about having something come through the Housing Committee on that issue, to have them recommend someone coming up with a plan. But I think that you're also talking about commercial space, right? And so not just the hotels and the homeless situation, but what is the plan for all the commercial vacancy that's being created, right? Is that what so how do we get something in place for that?
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's a good idea, and I think that if we recommended this sort of study, that the Department of City Planning would be the agency most appropriate for this. There could be an issue about the permitted uses in the zone that some of these office buildings are in, but often it's a C4 zone, which allows both residential and commercial. But, you know, obviously the study would have to look at what the existing zoning is. But I think it's a great idea. I just, for your information, wrote to Maria and Joe and copied others on a proposal for a comprehensive plan for the siting of homeless shelters in hotels, and that there needs to be some kind of plan that DHS collaborates with city planning and or a consultant, and they look at the inventories, and they look at repurposing or making safe the facilities that homeless people came from. So I wrote that proposal up today and sent it off to the co-chairs of the Housing Committee. But I'm glad that you raised this, Kit.
So I think that we can do a similar kind of request for commercial use, Kit, and I think that's a good thing to do. David, is your hand up because you wanted to add to this conversation, or is your hand still up from previous? Okay. Viren?
It's from previous.
Okay, thanks. Viren? And then I'll come back to you, Bert.
Yeah, what I wanted to tell you, that city planning and other agencies are looking at the issue of vacancy, but mostly in residential buildings, because there is an exodus from New York City, particularly Manhattan homes, who can afford to keep the Manhattan apartments vacant and move to other boroughs. They actually are doing so. Many of them are also moving out of New York City. Not that they're selling anything here in New York City, but city is considering, I'm told, from someone who works at Design Commission, but they're thinking about vacancy tax to sort of dissuade people from keeping their units vacant. That's number one. Number two, I teach at City College and Columbia University and Pratt Institute, and a number of architectural schools are looking at the possibility of retrofitting vacant commercial spaces. But those are academic studies, and my students, in fact, are looking at Hell's Kitchen as one of the sort of sites, which we can talk about and share. City to look at commercial space and retrofitting commercial space for their benefit is something they're not going to look at. But real estate industry itself is looking into that as far as what I'm hearing and what I'm reading. And it's not just about converting office buildings back into residential spaces if they were converted beforehand. Even they're looking at vacant malls in Queens and other places where they're considering both options. One is affordable housing, but immediately now they're also looking at shelters, similar to the hotels being converted. And the city is looking into that very actively. We just have to find out which agency. I don't have the information, but I offer to look into that.
Hey, Darren, if you could look into that and share it with us, that'd be great. And even if it's not Department of Buildings or Department of Planning, which we mostly would request for, Betty and I can certainly bring it forward to the other committee, to the budget task force, and see if we can insert it someplace else. Thanks. And Bert, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, some of this would happen, and I hate the word, because my background was in city planning, naturally, right? I think of all those office buildings that were converted to residences, okay? All the malls around the country, though I don't know any specifically here in the city, but malls around the country which are emptied, half of them becoming a healthcare facility. Hospitals are taking it over. Some offices moving in. They're repurposing themselves. So what study are we asking for? What study are we asking for? Are we asking for a zoning study? And, we talk about commercial vacancies. At this point in time, yes, a lot of people are not occupying their offices, but the space has not been given up yet. Okay? So we're at a certain point in time where we don't really know what the hell is going on. I mean, that's the reality, because office space is not being occupied, and at the same time, Facebook takes 700,000 square feet. All I'm throwing this out as there's lots going on, and we really don't know what's going on. Forget about the long term. We don't know what's even going on in the midterm. We don't, because no one's experienced this before.
Right. Kit had raised his hand as potentially to try to answer your question, Bert. Kit, was that?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with basically everything that Bert said, but I think the fact that we don't know is why it should be studied. And while we can't get, answers with 100% confidence to the questions that I think we want to ask, projections, I think, can inform decision-making that will be more prudent than if we just sort of let things organically play out. And, thinking about the type of building, I'll go back to my personal experience that we were in WeWork, I don't know that it can compete with the newer buildings that have been built in the last couple of decades when people are thinking about, okay, we're going to bring our employees back into the office. What do we want that to look like? In a world where, there's a ton of supply, and some of the supply is in buildings that are newer, better shape, better amenities. I think a lot of buildings, including buildings in our district that are very old, weren't necessarily in perfect condition, may not be re-inhabited, likely won't be re-inhabited at anywhere near the rates that they were pre-COVID. And so I think, especially the commercial space, presents an interesting opportunity to ask the question, how much do we think there's going to be and what do we want to do with it?
And I think to go back to Bert's issue of, are we asking for a zoning study or whatever? I think that maybe the way we phrase it is to study how alternative or modified uses of existing buildings could occur in the future if there's more of a housing need, but we have a lot of commercially zoned property, or there's more commercial need and we have housing, or we need hotels. And Jesse's going to stop me there.
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to raise my hand. I can't raise my hand because I'm the host. So
all right, okay. So, but I think, Bert, I think your point is well taken, that we ask for a study to be done on what modifications could be done within the current zoning to allow for alternative uses.
Okay.
Viren? And then Jesse.
I'm with Bert. I think the situation is very fluid. I'm a consultant to some of the other companies. I have my own practice as well as my consultancy, and one of the very, very large firms, right? But as we speak right now, is retrofitting a building downtown. Their existing workspace is being reconfigured to house from 33 to 64% of capacity. So the workstations are being redesigned, retrofitted, right? So it's a lot of little changes are happening, but at the same time, they're keeping the provision to switch back to what it used to be. On the other hand, well, just the way Bert said, things are very fluid. No one is actually giving up spaces. WeWork is a slightly different scenario. They were already in trouble before COVID, and the entire business model is suspect. So what's happening with them is very unique and very particular. But typically, if you look around major commercial spaces, vacancy rate buildings are vacant because people are not working in place. But people haven't sort of, what do you call them, terminated the leases yet. So that's another sort of unknown that we don't know about. There are subsidies in place, people are borrowing money, paying rents and whatever have you. I think we have at least about 6 months. And my other question is, who will do this study? Why would they do this study and for whose benefit? Commercial real estate is handled by commercial real estate. They know exactly where the mouth is, and they're going to put their money where the mouth is. So they're going to be doing these studies regardless. Why would city want to go and say, okay, you know what, we're going to help you out. We're going to spend taxpayers' money and do this study for you. That's not going to happen typically.
No, but Viren, the way I'm thinking about it is what Bert raises is to say to the Department of Planning, is to say, look at what steps can be taken if the commercial agents come to us and say, we want to use this residential zone for commercial. What steps can be taken to accommodate future needs that are unknown at this point? We don't know what's going to happen. So Department of Planning should be prepared for addressing some of the unknowns. So Jesse, you wanted to?
I was going to say a couple things. I think we've clearly always have made studies to DCP in the past priorities. You have currently a couple, I think, there already. And I do think this is quite a little bit more unique, and it might be something more in the city's EDC range rather than DCP. And I sort of think maybe what you guys are. One thing is, you don't, just for clarity's sake in terms of process, it's up to Paul and Betty and everybody else. We have October too. You don't have to be completely, finding all of the answers tonight to these questions. But so you can vote on this in October, maybe spend the month to think about it a little bit more. But so I think in some ways you're sort of asking for two things. One, there might be something in the budget that you want, right? That there's a budget request, which won't really get answered until next spring when the preliminary budget gets sent out. So I think Viren's point is like, there's plenty of time in between, and and I think Bert's saying this too, there's the private market's going to do their own thing. So who knows? So maybe the request won't be as highly functioning at that point, but maybe it's still a valid request, whatever it may be. But then there's another thing, which I think it sounds like you're making an idea of not so much a budget request, but a planning conversation to be happening. So what I think Paul's saying is that rather than just leaving it to the private market to come to the city with all of these ideas and proposals and say, here I'm going to make money on this, or here I'm going to do, is that there's got to be some sort of significant collaboration, whether we call it a task force or the city working group or whatever, to start thinking about what Kit's talking about, which is like, not, both commercial turning into residential, maybe residential turning into something else, health and hospital needs, all of that. And so that's more of I think just a general request that you're sending forward as what would come in out of a letter. And I would only say if that's in any way what maybe happens, is I think we definitely want to loop in the other land use committee on that. So it's a joint concept. Is that what we're saying is needed, right? Just because the geography of both of the district neighborhoods in the district are different. So we don't want to just assume something.
All right, so I think that to Jesse's point, we have another month of working through this. So I'd like to suggest that we close this conversation, but that if people have ideas and thoughts, that we bring them, send them along to me and Betty, and we'll add them in to the next month, and we'll have another discussion on this in our next meeting. And I see that as soon as I said let's not do it, we just went crazy. What?
I had my hand raised on the raise hand function.
Oh, I didn't see it. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Okay. I just to Jesse's point, his last point, I do agree with it in that maybe that there has to be collaboration with commercial turning residential. The two studies I think we could focus on, I thought that Williamsburg was converted from all a warehouse space to all residential. I remember talking to a friend of mine. She said, yeah, Bloomberg just said, zap, now you're residential. This is all commercial space. This is commercial water and whatever. So I don't know if that's necessarily true or what went into that to convert it from all factories and, buildings into residential. But I know specifically, I mean, that's one question or one study that could happen in terms of looking at that versus today. But also just more recently, I think 2 years ago, a courthouse downtown on Broadway and Worth around there is being converted to condominium spaces, to residential spaces. So it's not just necessarily commercial.
It can definitely happen. It is a longer process than just somebody saying it's done. But I appreciate that input on that tweet. And then Viren, I wanted to.
No, I was just going to clarify, conversion is not difficult. The mechanism is already in place. So Williamsburg didn't happen on the fly. I mean, it happened through whatever process that's available to everybody. And that process is still available to convert a commercial space into condominium. You go through whatever, standard sort of approval process. Converting manufacturing is a little harder. And, we know all about that too. So those mechanisms are already in place. Putting residential in a commercial zone is not impossible. It's done all the time.
Right, but in the context of the budgeting, it's that we want to plan for what we don't know. So Marty, you wanted to?
I just want to say that you're asking wonderful questions, and you're not identifying who would do the study. It's a fairly complex study that you're talking about, and the people who do the study will be, as you know, that because they have their own visions, whoever they are will in some way predetermine its end. But I think part of the question that Paul wants to ask us to think about for the next month is who the hell would do a fairly complex study like the one you're suggesting.
Yeah, and as Jesse points out, it could be the planning or it could be EDC, but okay. All right, Betty wants to add some more. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add that in this study, I think it's even more complex because I think that professional people may be changing the way they do their work. I guess from a personal standpoint, Rich, my husband, is a psychotherapist. So he has his private office with a group of other private offices in an old office building on West 46th Street between 5th and 6th, okay? No one is going to their offices physically to see patients, all right? So in the field of psychotherapy and other similar professions, everybody is really scratching their heads that maybe there is going to be a permanent change in the way you see your patients online or through Zoom or through another visual program. So I just think it's a very complicated issue. And I liked Kit's thrust about affordable housing and maybe low income housing or middle income housing, because there's such a great need in the city for that. I like the link of that. I don't want us to lose that thrust because, you might be able to have some program that encourage certain kind of housing, not just high income housing in conversions, but, a subsidy program or something that could encourage that kind of housing. The building that Rich has his office in is quite old, and I just not sure it's going to come back. So
right, and that echoes an important distinction. And what I'd like to ask everybody to think about for the next meeting is to think about how do we put this in the context of land use, right? So these old buildings, individual buildings, whatnot, but this is more of a zoning and usage conversation. So if you could think through that a little bit, that'd be helpful. And then let's see if we can come up with some good points in October. So thanks.
So we're not. So Paul, we're not going to produce anything now for the budget committee tomorrow night.
It doesn't sound like we need to, and I don't think we have to.
You don't need to. The budget task force is meeting tomorrow, their first meeting for this process, and I'll give them. Bert will be there, I believe, so he can definitely give them an update as to where you guys are heading. But I do think, just for clarity's sake, I do think going through the existing priorities still is a need, should be done. And so obviously things that have been funded should, if you guys are comfortable with that and removing it from the list and reprioritizing them in any way to give the budget task force when they meet in October to finalize the budget priorities, some guidance, that would be helpful as well. So if that's something the committee could do, that would be helpful. And I still do think, but Paul's original point, which is the focusing on whatever we want to call it, COVID-19 issues or the right now problems, I do think the budget task force is going to want to hear that as well. So, that doesn't make it more complicated, but yeah.
So are you saying that we should produce something for tomorrow night or not?
No, I'm sorry. You do not need to produce anything for tomorrow night. I think you would aim for your October.
Okay.
October vote.
All right.
And everybody should send things to Paul and Betty.
And Bert, you can give the flavor of our discussion tonight to the budget group, right?
Great. All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate that. Under old and new business, we didn't have anything. I just do want to report that, and Tina, I don't know if you've responded yet or not, but we've discussed in the past the expansion of the Flatiron Business Improvement District. There is another meeting coming up that I will be attending, and I think Tina's going to plan to attend. Tina, can you nod if you're? Yes, good. So we'll we'll have more to report out on that. I don't suspect there's going to be any change from the previous discussions, so we'll just update after we hear from them. Anybody else have anything else to bring up, Bert?
Just clarification or information. What was the final resolution at Landmarks about the Gansenport? Or wasn't there a final resolution?
Yeah, there was. They approved a 6-story.
They did approve it. Okay, that's all. Yeah.
Building. They approved a 6-story building, and they required more preservation measures for the row house historic.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if it was approved or not. I remember they came back with the new plan and everything like that.
They came back with that.
David, you want to?
David?
Yeah, they didn't approve 6 stories. They approved actually an 8-story building.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I misspoke.
Yeah, the applicant lowered the parapet and reduced the floor-to-floor height and only removed 1 story. And the commissioners really changed their tune quite a bit from the first meeting where, a lot of them objected to any construction at all in the backyards of the row houses. So I don't know, I felt like it was a little bit of a rope-a-dope, where in the public hearing, they sounded like they were going to do the right thing and then contradicted themselves in accepting it. And even in the public meeting, the second meeting on the revised scheme, a lot of them said this would be still better if it were a story shorter. And it just leaves open the question of, well, why did you allow it? Why vote for it if it's still a story too tall? And, that might go to political influence or who knows,
But I do want to say that the input that we had was very powerful. If you look at the original plan and the restoration of those townhouses, and then what is the end result, because the rear walls and side walls and interior walls, there was so much more restoration of those townhouses because of the work that like David and Pam and the rest of us did to really push for that. And in terms of the height of the infill building, they did reduce it by over 30 feet. So it's a significant, and they changed the cladding so it blends in a little better. So, I mean, it may not be perfect, but it's significantly improved based on the work that we did, I think.
Yeah, I think we did very well.
I think the biggest thing we learned, is that they played us a little bit in terms of actually having much taller ceiling to floor height initially, and then squeezing in exactly the same number of floors that they wanted right from the start. So we got played a little bit, but I think the fact that they reduced the height significantly is the win, I think.
Yeah. So thanks for asking, Bert.
But next time someone comes with 14 feet ceiling height, be careful. That's all I can say.
Yeah, it's a good lesson. Reduce the height by reducing the floor to ceiling height. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody.
I have one more thing.
Jesse?
Very quickly, I mentioned this at housing, so I just wanted to mention it at Clue. And I don't know if everybody saw the press release from Brad Hoylman's office. If you remember last year, Brad Hoylman's office gave basically the community boards that he covers the ability to advocate directly for state funding for a number of projects that were on our budget list. long time projects on our budget priority list. And so the one was an education project, a science labs that we've been advocating for a while. But the other one was infrastructure for the Fulton houses. And so I just wanted to highlight that for folks, that the Fulton houses have been asking for sump pumps for the TA, the Tenants Association president and leadership had been asking for that for many years. And that's moving ahead. It's not completely done yet, and we don't know exactly if the funding will be in yet, but it's moving ahead in that. And then, so Brad sent out a press release on that. I just wanted to highlight that for everybody here. That, you know.
I could also say that the working group, the Chelsea working group, is starting up again, and Hector knows that. And Joe and Hector and Elzora and I are involved in that. And I don't know how it's going to work on Zoom.
You're forgetting another member again. Why do you keep doing that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Michael, and Michael too.
Again.
Uh-oh, slap my wrist.
Not just you. Not just you.
Well, anyway, maybe because your window is smaller, Michael. Anyway, so I don't know how it's going to work on Zoom. We used to have these gigantic meetings with the tenants and other organizations and the Citizens Committee and the Housing Authority folks. And it's hard for me to envision how Zoom is going to work. So I don't know. Do you want to say anything about that, Michael?
Negative.
Hector? Hector, what do you think?
Actually, I'm kind of excited about the whole prospect of starting this up again. A lot of challenges to overcome, as you said, Betty. Zoom has its limitations, but at least it's better than nothing at this point. So I'm sure we'll figure something out. I mean, obviously, it's going to take a lot of work, but I think we'll get it done one way or the other.
Oh, I like your optimism. Anyway.
Is it a public meeting, or is it going to be just a private group meeting?
Well, the plan is we were having these meetings among the members that were originally part of the work group. And we're going to have public workshops development, hopefully in a couple of weeks if everything goes according to plan. Normally we would have that to the general public, obviously. There's going to be some limitations, obviously, because of social distancing restrictions. We're still trying to figure it out, how we can disseminate all this information out to the public in a safe manner and have proper feedback as well. That seems to be one of the biggest obstacles we're running into right now. So, but we'll get it done one way or the other.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks so much for your first. Did you want to say something before we left, Carrie? Were you raising your hand to say something?
No, I just wanted to say thank you. Sorry, I feel quiet, but I'm a little bit,
No, it's good.
It's all new.
All right,
learning the acronyms.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
We'll talk soon. And Carrie,
Good night, everybody.
Be safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Bye-bye.
All right, I'm going to get off now. I guess Marty and Tina
Now
really
shut the rest of us
go.
down. You know.
All right, goodbye, guys.